David Morgan. È professore di studi religiosi e storia dell'arte presso la Duke University nella Carolina del Nord degli Stati Uniti. Fino a questo anno è stato dal 2013 in poi anche il decano del Dipartimento di Studi Religiosi della medesima università. Gran parte delle sue ricerche e pubblicazioni esplorano la storia della cultura religiosa visuale, visiva. Titolo come La fucina di visioni, una storia visiva del cristianesimo moderno. O anche questo titolo, Il Sacro Cuore di Gesù, l'evoluzione visiva di una devozione. Una delle sue ultime pubblicazioni è intitolato Immagini al lavoro, la cultura materiale dell'incantamento. La sua relazione di oggi è intitolato Eros e visione nella devozione al Sacro Cuore e parla in inglese.
It's very good to be here in this wonderful city and to have the opportunity to speak with you about the history of the Sacred Heart. In her autobiography, Margaret Mary Alacoque described her long wooing by Jesus, the divine suitor, who would become her spouse and enjoy a mystical union with her, whose revelations would encourage devotion to the Sacred Heart. The amorous nature of the relation was registered in the visual expression of the devotion by Alacoque herself in the form of the Valentine's heart. How do I advance? Whose emblematic form, treated as an exchange of hearts, had emerged in romantic and courtly love in the late Middle Ages, as these images suggest. In terms of Christian mysticism, the devotion to the Sacred Heart was, of course, much older than Alacoque's experiences in the late 17th century. The nuptial mysticism that deeply structured her experience of Christ's heart first emerged from St. Gertrude and the two Mechtilds of Helfta in the 13th century, and recurred frequently over the next several centuries, then reached a crescendo in the 17th century, culminating in the career of Alacoque at Paray-le-Monial. Mother Marguerite Clement, a visitationist nun in the generation before Alacoque's, and someone who described an intimate exchange of hearts with Jesus, in the words of the Jesuit historian of the Sacred Heart, Jean Banvel, quote, had a clear intuition that the visitation order had been instituted by the Sacred Heart and in the interest of the Sacred Heart, unquote. I think Banvel is on the right track. There was something about the visitationist order that provided an institutional disposition that favored nuptial mysticism and therefore helps account for the rising series of mystical experiences of the Sacred Heart in France leading to Alacoque. And it is here that I want to make a contribution by focusing on the visual culture of the Sacred Heart in the 17th century in order to clarify its particular course and function. In particular, I will restrict my comments to tracing two strands. The devotion of Jean Eudes on the one hand and of Margaret Mary Alacoque on the other, as a way of highlighting their difference from one another and what distinguishes both of them from the Jesuit articulation of the devotion in the early 18th century. These differences are not absolute. There is, of course, more unity than difference, but I don't want the differences to get lost because I think they're very interesting. My argument is that the amorous character of nuptial mysticism at work in Alacoque was diminished somewhat by Eudes and retasked by the Jesuits as they undertook an important shift from features of Alacoque's mysticism as the Society of Jesus moved toward establishing the devotion on far more popular terms in the 18th century, dedicated to the sacred humanity of Jesus' body. There are some fascinating re-rememberings, which is another way of saying some subtle forgettings, that I want to draw our attention to in the visual materials associated with the devotion to the Sacred Heart. Let me begin with this image, which was used to illustrate Jean Eudes' major theological work, The Admirable Heart of the Very Holy Mother of God, a 3-volume, 1,800-page production that he completed just weeks before his death in 1680. The book appeared in the following year. When precisely this image was produced, I have not been able to determine. The presence of the two Eudists, who are labeled Sons of the Venerable Father Eudes, in a 1908 edition of the Admirable Heart in Eudes' complete works, suggests that the image came after his death. The two kneel before a flaming, floating heart occupied by the Virgin and Child, and light their long tapers in the flames emerging from the top of the heart. In a ribbon above the heart, we read that this is, quote, the heart of Jesus and Mary, the furnace of love. One of the Eudists uses his taper to ignite the globe beneath the heart, and each of them holds a flaming heart in his hand. This motif is familiar from the portrayal of St. Augustine and from Eudes' own portraiture before and after his death, as well as from portrayals of Jane of Chantal and Francis de Sales. Here's Eudes and St. Augustine, and here is Eudes, Jane Chantal, and St. Francis de Sales. Note that sometimes the heart is the inflamed organ of the believer, and sometimes labeled the heart of Jesus or Jesus and Mary. The ambivalence is characteristic of Eudist iconography. The 12th book of Eudes' Admirable Heart is called, quote, On the Divine Heart of Jesus. And there he stated that the heart of Jesus is, quote, a furnace of love in regard to the Most Holy Mother, the flames of which sparkle in marvelous privileges by which he has enriched her, unquote. That suggests that what we are looking at in this image is the Sacred Heart of Jesus, as Eudes understood it. He was never concerned with portraying a single image of the heart of Jesus per se, as it came to be with Alacoque and the Jesuits. That is why, as Jean Benvel noted, Eudes tended not to differentiate the two hearts, speaking not of hearts in the plural, but usually in the heart, singular, of Jesus and Mary, assuming that they were one and the same, or very, very closely linked. For Eudes, the heart of Jesus was inextricable from the heart of Mary and from the flame it kindled in the hearts of devotees. But for the nuptial tradition in which the heart of Jesus was exchanged for the heart of his lovers, Christ's heart was singularly the focus, which developed a very discrete iconography even as early as Alacoque, as these images from the last years of her life suggest, produced in the circle at Paray-le-Monial. Proponents of Eudes' understanding of the Sacred Heart of Mary have insisted that the two devotions are not at odds with one another, while some prominent Jesuit interpreters of Alacoque's devotion have insisted on distinguishing them. Two features stand out in this debate. One is the insistence by Eudes that the heart of Mary is one and the same with the heart of Jesus. And second, Eudes did not stress the key role of reparations that Alacoque did in her devotion to the Sacred Heart. For those committed to the idea of Mary as co-redemptress, the pairing of the hearts of Jesus and Mary makes perfect sense. The two suffer together. But in the history of nuptial mysticism, while the Virgin is always revered, she represents something perhaps of a tension between the devotee and Jesus as bridegroom. The strongly Eucharistic link in the Sacred Heart of Jesus in Gertrude of Helfte grew even stronger in Alacoque and is expressed in, among other things, the idea of reparations for sins of neglecting the Eucharist, which some Jesuit critics of Eudes faulted him for ignoring. In the image that accompanied the posthumous publication of the Admirable Heart, the Congregation of Jesus and Mary appears at the top and displays the heart of Jesus and Mary as a furnace of love. The furnace is a figure much discussed by the mystical tradition since the late Middle Ages. Eudes gave it careful attention in his book, where he developed a complement to the nuptial imagery cultivated from the Song of Songs by women religious since the 13th century. He called the Magnificat, quote, the sacred canticle of the very holy heart of the Blessed Virgin, unquote. In other words, the Magnificat was for Eudes the loving response of the soul of Mary to her divine suitor, God the Father. Earlier in the book, Eudes took up the relation between Mary and God the Father. Quoting the Song of Songs, chapter 4, verse 9 from the Vulgate, which reads in English, "You have wounded my heart, my sister, my bride. You have wounded my heart with a glance of your eyes, with one jewel of your necklace," unquote. Eudes then asks, who is speaking in here? Who is saying this? And then he answers his own question, quote, "It is the Eternal Father." To whom does he address these words? It is to the Blessed Virgin, whom he calls his sister and his spouse. He says that she wounds his heart in order to express the very ardent love and the immense and infinite manner in which the heart of the Divine Mary is inflamed with respect to this adorable Father, and to express the incomprehensible love that he has for his unique and well-loved daughter, unquote. Eudes cited St. Bernardine of Siena, who praised, quote, that divine love with which the heart of the Virgin burned like a fiery furnace. From this heart, as a furnace of divine ardor, the Blessed Virgin brought forth her response to God. Eudes also quoted St. Bernardine, hailing the heart of Jesus as, quote, a furnace of very ardent love, inflaming and burning the entire universe, unquote. This recalls the lowered taper in the image, which you see here, the Eudes on the lower left. The taper is placed beneath the orb in order to ignite it with love, with divine love, symbolizing the divine love that ignites the entire world. A caption beneath the image, as it appears in the 6th volume of Eudes' collected works, alludes to this. It reads, quote, the sons of the Venerable Père Eudes, taking from the heart of Jesus and Mary the fire of divine love to ignite the world, unquote. But for Eudes, the two hearts were joined. He asserted this clearly when he opened the 12th book of the Admirable Heart, devoted entirely to the heart of Jesus. It reads as follows, it is not right to separate two things that God has joined so closely by the strongest bonds and by the very tightest knots of nature, of the grace and the glory. I want to speak of the divine heart of Jesus, the only Son of Mary, and the virginal heart of Mary, mother of Jesus. These two hearts of Jesus and Mary are so intimately united that the heart of Jesus is the principle of the heart of Mary, as the Creator is the principle of his creature, and that the heart of Mary is the origin of the heart of Jesus, as the mother is the origin of the heart of her child." Unquote. It seems clear that for Eudes, the Sacred Heart of Jesus was part and parcel of the heart of Mary. Alacoque's spirituality, however, moved in a somewhat different direction. Eudes regarded the nuptial relation to pertain principally to Mary and God the Father, rather than to Jesus and the nun. Perhaps this produced a maternal focus more suitable to a congregation of priests like Eudes. In any case, it certainly endorsed the popular idea of Mary as co-redemptress. But as the Jesuits worked closely with Alacoque in the last 15 years of her life, the significance of the devotion came to reside in the Eucharistic significance of the heart, specifically in its key role in the devotion of generating reparations for the abuses suffered by the heart of Christ in the Eucharist. For Alacoque, the devotion first centered in her mystical relation with Jesus as her spouse and the favors he showed her. But increasingly, she became focused on the heart's Eucharistic meaning, the importance of reparations, and the role of imagery in establishing and disseminating the devotion among women religious and dispensing among them the blessings promised by the Sacred Heart. In all of this, Alacoque was dedicated to concentrating on the heart itself, as the imagery she endorsed clearly shows. As it took shape in the 1690s following her death, the imagery remained close in spirit to what Alacoque had endorsed. Here are a couple examples from the 1690s. For a time, the image of the heart continued to be emblematic, a Valentine's shape encircled by a decorative lacework of thorns. The imagery confirms that for Alacoque, the heart was always very clearly the heart of Jesus and his alone. It was this heart that had come to her in the special favors of the mystical union of sponsus and sponsa. None of the ambivalence that moves through Eudist iconography is present in Alacoque's conceptions. After her death, the Jesuits continued to treat the heart as the singular focus of the devotion and regarded Alacoque's mystical favors as endorsing the new devotion, which they labored to show was not new, but rooted in the past and authoritatively established by Christ in the life of Alacoque. So the Jesuits focused their energy on shaping the devotion theologically. The fleshly character of the heart came to the fore as a development of the discrete focus on the heart of Jesus, resulting in a new iconography that was really quite different. In the images you see here from Joseph de Galifet's 1726 treatise, De Cultu Sacrosancti Cordis Dei, we find the hearts of Jesus and Mary clearly distinguished from one another and anatomically detailed. The Valentine emblem and its rococo frilliness have been exchanged for a carnal verity. The thorns are no longer a decorative motif encircling the heart in an emblematic form, but now a tautly wound set of cords binding the organ and tearing at its flesh. The wound is an anatomically accurate slit into the meat of the heart, not an oblong shape stretching from one side of a Valentine heart to the other. The Jesuits made a point of ignoring and marginalizing Eudes in the process of building the case for the official recognition of the Sacred Heart and in promoting the cause of Alacoque for beatification. Among the dozens of theologians, church fathers, nuns, and mystics whom the Jesuit father Joseph de Galifet marshaled in a detailed defense of the devotion, he made only one reference to Jean Eudes in a long chapter on Mary's heart, referring to Eudes as, quote, an eminent client of the Sacred Heart of Mary, unquote. Monsignor Jean-Joseph Languet de Gergy, Bishop of Soissons, made no reference to Eudes in his Life of the Venerable Margaret Mary, a biography published in 1729 to promote Alacoque's cause for beatification. This marginalization is telling, and there were several reasons for it. The putative confusion of Mary's heart with the heart of Jesus was certainly one. Another reason was Eudes' silence on reparations, as I've mentioned, and their importance for understanding the Eucharistic relevance of the Sacred Heart as Alacoque understood it. In particular, in regard to the urgency of frequent communion as a primary means of dispensing grace, which of course went on to be one of the major contentions raised by the Jansenists against the Sacred Heart. And like Alacoque, Galifet also stressed the key importance of displaying images of the Sacred Heart as an explicit revelation of Jesus to Alacoque. But it appears that the Eudists were not happy with the Jesuit bias against their founder. An image that was probably painted sometime in the opening decades of the 18th century may well register their discontent. You see it here in color beside the black and white is an engraving that was produced earlier, I think, and then the painting was produced somewhat later, I think by the Eudists in response to the Jesuit campaign to promote Alacoque. You can see that the painting on the right borrows the motif of the engraving of Mary and the infant Jesus in a flaming heart on the left. I have not been able to determine the exact date or even the painter of this image, but there is enough evidence to suggest something about its purpose. The changes that have been made to the engraving's content are very interesting. The two Eudist acolytes are replaced by two figures, a male saint on the left and a female religious on the right. Who are they and why are they there? The male figure wears white robes, which could be Carthusian, but the source of the figure indicates it is the great Cistercian mystic Bernard of Clairvaux. Indeed, it would appear that the painting you see here on the left, a portrait of Bernard receiving mystical inspiration, provided the model mildly adjusted for the figure on the right in the painting. And the female figure bears the robes and habit of a Cistercian nun, which, though she was Benedictine technically, is what Gertrude and her sisters at Helfta had wanted to be. Gertrude was especially fond of Bernard's writings, especially his famous set of sermons on the Canticles, the Song of Songs, which did so much to shape the tradition of nuptial mysticism among women religious. So if I'm correct about this, this painting is a visual rejoinder from the Eudists, using a modified version of their own image to correct the Jesuit presentism by countering the neglect of Eudes' role in promoting the Sacred Heart. Eudes, after all, had read about the Sacred Heart as a young oratorian in the work of Gertrude, Mechthild, Bernard of Clairvaux, and the Carthusian writer Johannes Lanspergius, who had published the first Latin edition of Gertrude's Life and Revelation in 1536. By 1640, Eudes had fixed on the heart of Mary as the vehicle for understanding his focus on divine love. And in the Admirable Heart, he mentioned Gertrude's mystical devotion to the heart and drew on St. Bernard's devotion to the Virgin as authoritative support for honoring the heart of Mary. This image urges that the combined energies of Jesus, and Mary are the source of divine love that will inflame the world. The Jesuits were headed in a different direction. This is clear in this image, which served as the frontispiece of Galifet's a book Galifet published in 1733. The heart floats effulgently among a host of angels, a pope, a bishop, a monk, a king, and a soldier, all of whom gather to worship as the church, which one 19th century Jesuit writer called, quote, the most affectionate spouse of the Savior. So now the spouse the Jesuits want to focus on is the church, the entire ecclesium, rather than the mystical experiences of Alacoque herself. It is critical to note this shift in spouses from the nuptial mysticism of a cloistered nun to ecclesia, the church universal. Accordingly, the heart is no longer an emblem of amor, or eros, but a corporeal organ, the very stuff of the Eucharist. The caption that you see in this one reads, they will come and adore. This caption commands the future of the devotion by alluding to its past, perhaps specifically to the Gospel of Matthew, the account of the Magi who found the newborn child and, as the Vulgate reads, adored him. But the caption may also recall the 17th century Latin hymn attributed to King João IV of Portugal, translated into the familiar Christmas carol, O come, let us adore him. Venite adoremus. It is a text referring to the Nativity, and therefore to the Incarnation as the biblical basis for the future of the devotion of the Sacred Heart of Jesus. If that is correct, then Galifet substituted for the emblem of a nuptial mysticism the biological organ in order to register the devotion's emphasis on the Incarnation, and therefore helped move the devotion from the margins of a religious order to the center of the Catholic faith. Thank you.
Sì, grazie per questo intervento su una piccola battaglia, no, fra edisti e gesuiti, ma che anche nelle sue trasformazioni anche indicatore di contenuti